All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Vasyl Lomachenko was nothing but a hype job, and Gervonta Tank Davis wants no smoke with me. Floyd Mayweather Jr. won't even let him say my name, says Gary Russell Jr., the 126 WBC champion. Let's talk about what he has to say in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, had a guest on the Instagram Live on Friday. Mr. Gary Russell Jr. stopped by the Instagram, did an interview with me. Thank you very much. It was a great interview. If you follow me on Instagram, you can get the whole interview over there on Instagram. But there's a lot of jewels in there. One of the things that he talked about, I asked him about the Teofimo Lopez-Vasyl Lomachenko fight. Reasonable thing to ask him about because Gary Russell Jr. fought Vasyl Lomachenko and had been looking for a rematch with Vasyl Lomachenko for a bunch of years. But Vasyl Lomachenko does not believe in rematches and did not give Gary Russell Jr. a rematch. He said he was past it. He's on to another phase of his career, just like he didn't give Orlando Salido a rematch. They just kept it moving, right? That's what you do with hype jobs, okay? Because if a guy gives him a decent fight, you don't rematch. You got to weigh there. You don't want to go back and just in case the guy figured something out. Now, at least that's my point of view. But I had been saying that Vasyl Lomachenko was a hype job for a very long time. And by that, I'm not saying that I ever thought that he's not a very, very good fighter. He is a very, very good fighter. So is Gary Russell Jr. And the idea that anybody does not know that this guy is the best 126-pound fighter in the world, therefore making him one of the best fighters in the world. The idea that you guys don't see that is absolutely ridiculous to me. And he is one of the pure examples of how the politics of boxing does not always result in the people who you think are the best actually being acknowledged, actually being the best. The idea that Gary Russell Jr. is not on a pound-for-pound list, Gervonta Davis is not on a pound-for-pound list. Jermell Charlo is not on a pound-for-pound list. Jamal Charlo is not on a pound-for-pound list. Demetrius Andrade is not on a pound-for-pound list. I can go on and on and on and on, right? But you got guys like Vasyl can lose. He's 14-2, still pops back up there, okay? Gennady Golovkin has not been a serious contender or somebody that people think seriously about as being one of the top fighters in the world for a couple years now. But yet there he sits on people's pound-for-pound list, convincing the casual fans who just might be brushing by that big, gigantic platform to see what they have to say about boxing, only to walk up and be fooled by a bunch of lists of people that half of the people that voted for him didn't see fight. Anyway, that's the world we live in, where Gary Russell Jr. is just asked for a rematch with Vasyl Lomachenko, and people say, oh, no, that fight was over. We already know the outcome of that fight. We don't need to see that fight, right? Deontay Wilder wants a rematch with Tyson Fury, and it's contractually obligated, and and Tyson Fury is contractually obligated to give it to him. But it doesn't matter, I don't know. What's right is right only for who I want it to be right for. To heck with his rematch clause, right? But anyway, Vasyl Lomachenko was a hype job. The loss was going to happen, and there's a couple other guys that their losses are about to pop up like Monster Inoue. However, Gary Russell Jr. said, look, man, I didn't even watch the fight. It's like, man, why wouldn't you watch the fight? He's like, look, man, I mean, he's a hype job. I knew the outcome of the fight. It's not surprising. That's what boxing is right now. And boxing is like, because I said, man, why? It strikes me so funny that so many fighters, when I asked them if they see fights, said, nah, I didn't watch the fight. So it's like, why wouldn't you want to, that's your profession, you love boxing, you know it better than 99.9999999% of the fans watching it on TV. I thought, I would think that you'd be into it. He's like, look, man, why would I want to watch a fight where I already know the outcome? And that's what boxing is doing right now. You go he's like, look up and down these cards. He said, man, I can go up and down the cards and I know who's going to win before I watch the fight. And that's the truth, because that's how I'm making money on boxing, right? I don't particularly, other than like the YouTube stuff, if I place a bet on boxing, because I am starting to have a little more fun with that, dude, it's always on. It's on the crookedness, right? I bet on the crookedness. I bet that, yeah, I think that Vasyl Lomachenko should be able to win this, but Teofimo Lopez is the rising star. Nah, Teofimo Lopez is going to get that decision if it goes there. And we all know it because we all do it. We all look up and down those cards coming out of Matchroom, coming out of ESPN, and know exactly who was going to win all those fights, right? It's just a dog and pony show, and it's terrible. So he said, that's why I don't watch a lot of fights. He's like, when I was coming up, you could see a bunch of fights, and you didn't know who was going to win. You just like, oh man, who's gonna win? And that's, dude, isn't that supposed to be the intrigue of a boxing match? Is that you don't know how to win? But what we're being sold as is every boxing match is really just a coronation for stuff that needs to be happening outside the ring, right? So we don't really care if these guys fight the best guys. We just care that, he's getting all the accolades outside the ring. It's terrible, and that's why he says that he doesn't watch it, right? But then he goes on and says, talks about Gervonta Davis. Because I asked, like, okay, what do you want to do from here? Now he's like, man, I got a bunch of different, people in name or whatever, but guys don't want to fight me. And he mentions, he's like, for example, Gervonta Davis. Gervonta Davis is at 130 pounds. Miguel Berchelt is at 130 pounds. Gary Russell said, hey, man, I wasn't even thinking about 130 pounds. I already whooped the champion at 130 pounds in JoJo Diaz. I wasn't really thinking about Berchelt and these guys. But, hey, man, if Tank is going to be down there, hey, I'll move into the weight class. Now, watch. If Gervonta Tank – and he said specifically, he said, look what they did, what Floyd Mayweather Jr. did to Gary Russell, to Gervonta Davis when he snatched that mic out of his mouth, right? He's saying as soon as Gervonta Davis starts saying my name, Floyd Mayweather Jr. tells him to be quiet because he don't want to lose. Now, here's the thing. Y'all better believe that Gary Russell Jr. can beat these guys, okay? I believe Gary Russell Jr. can beat these guys because I saw him fight Vasyl Lomachenko. And Vasyl Lomachenko, I don't care what you guys say, Gary did not dominate Gary Russell Jr. And Gary Russell Jr. saying, look, man, I was dehydrated during that fight. I didn't have my same energy. He had a long layoff and all that. You can say that that's an excuse or whatever. But I'll tell you this. After Gary Russell Jr., that's when the Matrix began. And all that stuff about people quitting and they can't figure it out and all that. None of that stuff happened with Gary Russell Jr. None of it. Gary Russell Jr.'s fight with Vasyl Lomachenko went the distance. And Gary Russell Jr. Knocked down Vasyl Lomachenko, right? He knocked him down just like Linares knocked him down. But don't expect mainstream media or any of these quote unquote boxing fans to get his guys' credit and even entertain the fact that Gary Russell Jr. can beat these guys, right? Because it just doesn't suit what their plans are. The idea that these guys, like almost universally, and now except big credit to Devin Haney. Because Devin Haney is the only guy that actually said, that took Gary Russell Jr. seriously. It's like, I'll fight you in 140 pounds. They went through all of that stuff. People can say that it was this or was that or whatever. But I spoke to both people. I believe Gary Russell Jr. wanted that fight. I believe Devin Haney wanted that fight. And why wouldn't they? Gary Russell Jr. believes he can beat Devin Haney. Devin Haney is a young kid. Don't know ish from Shinola is what he's saying, right? And he's that highly skilled fighter. But, the way the boxing works, dog, you can just, unless you as boxing fans push on this, keep their name in the media, keep the pressure on these other guys to fight a guy like Gary Russell Jr., dude, they can just fake like they're the best fighters in the world. And that's one of the things that Gary Russell Jr. said. He was like, look, it's like these guys they look at me and they say to each other, you can't beat him and I can't beat him. How about we fight each other and don't let him fight anybody? And that way we can look like we're the best. Isn't that what Josh Warrington is doing in the UK? Isn't it? Josh Warrington said, I would take the Leo Santa Cruz fight. He wants the Leo Santa Cruz fight. But he don't want the Gary Russell Jr. fight. Why do you want the Leo Santa Cruz fight and not the Gary Russell Jr. fight? Why Leo Santa Cruz want the Tank fight, not the Gary Russell Jr. fight? There is a very slick southpaw, right, with a good amount of pop in his hands that is being avoided by these guys, and there's no way around it. Now, can he beat Gervonta Davis? Yeah, dude. He can beat Gervonta Davis. Will he beat Gervonta Davis? I don't know. But can he beat him? Yes. And why is that? Because he's a different style of fighter than these other guys are. Gervonta Davis is going to have a much more difficult time, first of all, landing shots on him. And when you throw a jab, you're going to get hit with a couple shots. Gary Russell Jr.'s hands are faster than Tank's. He's more experienced than Tank. He doesn't hit as hard as Tank, but he hits hard enough to keep Tank's respect. And hopefully we'll be able to see that fight. But you know how it goes. Now, I got a lot of respect for Tank and Floyd Mayweather Jr., Leonard Ellerbe, and everybody else involved for what they're doing with his career. But you know they don't want that smoke because they think that they can lose, and that might upset the apple cart. That's the 400-pound gorilla in the room in these lower weight classes is a 135-pound cat from D.C., Gary Russell Jr. And y'all need to man up and fight this dude. But that's my take on the matter. You let me know yours. And with that, I'm out. Peace.